Hi, and welcome to week 14, our second to last week of the semester. This week, our focus is going to be on singing, and indeed, that focus is going to extend into week 15 as well. We'll be getting into Romantic era opera in the second lecture for this week, but first, we're going to focus on singing in the Romantic. Singing that takes different forms than lieder and different forms than opera. There is more to song than that, so that's what we're going to be getting into today. Now, last time we discussed different composers' responses to change in this early Romantic era, and we saw that through what Felix Mendelssohn was doing in approaching an established form in a different way through his violin concerto, which emphasized a different sort of relationship between soloist and orchestra. And we also talked about Franz Schubert's string quintet, an inherited form which he uses in a different way, blending his own lyricism with some of Beethoven's drama, and setting up some interesting compositional problems to be worked out throughout the work. Today, though, we are focusing on singing, and specifically singing that happens in different contexts than what we've looked at so far. So, if we were meeting in person, I'd ask you to brainstorm what sorts of music a community needs, what sorts of active music making a community needs. We asked a variation of this question before, and we talked a little bit about the importance of music listening for different kinds of community. But it's interesting for us to think about how music making, doing the act of music together, can be really interesting for building community. This is probably something that you're quite aware of now that we're all isolated, but the act of singing together can be a really important bonding one and can help people to connect in a different way than they would otherwise. And as you'll see from the chapter that's assigned this week, that's something that is leaned into in various different places and in various different ways throughout the Romantic era. So we've already talked a little bit about amateur music making in the Romantic, specifically looking at music making in the home, on the piano, so solely piano works, or art song works that would include singing and accompaniment. We've also looked at chamber music that could be performed within the home with one's friends as well. However, group amateur music making, larger group amateur music making, happened too. And so today we're going to be focusing on choral singing, whether unofficial, so groups of friends gathered in a home, or choral societies, or religious groups that are using song in interesting ways during this era. It makes sense that singing would be one of the biggest amateur music groups because you have your instrument with you always. It takes a little bit less planning to be able to show up and sing than it does to be able to say, show up and bring your harp with you. So it is easy to see why that would be a really appealing thing. It's also appealing for other reasons, which we'll talk about in a second here. I have an extended quote to share with you. The cultivation of a taste for music furnishes to the rich, or our upper classes, a refined and intellectual pursuit, which excludes the indulgence of frivolous and vicious amusements, and to the poor, a sweet solace from labor, a relaxation from toil, more attractive than the haunts of intemperance, which means drinking. Wherever the working classes are taught to prefer the pleasures of the intellect and even of taste to the gratification of sense, a great and favorable change takes place in their character and manners. Sentiments are awakened in them which makes them love their families and homes. Their wages are not squandered in intemperance, and they become happier as well as better. So that comes from George Hogarth's Musical History, which is written right around this time period. And as you could probably tell from that quote, there's a lot of social class judgments being made there, but it is pretty typical of its era in thinking that establishing music making for the masses is important, not just because music is great, but also because it can help the masses become better. It can help them, quote, rise above their stations. It can better them in some way, which is obviously a problematic idea in quite a few aspects, but it's also a widespread idea at this point. And it's one of the reasons why some of this amateur music making is going to receive funding. We see brass bands popping up in England, funded by factories and factory towns. So there is a support for communal music making because it's thought that not only do we get the benefit of the music, but we also get some higher benefit. And that also makes sense in different kinds of music making that we'll see elsewhere in the world, too. So, of course, the idea of communal music making in religion is not a new one, but I wanted to take a moment to talk about it because during this time period, we see a really interesting sort of communal music making develop in the Protestant traditions in the US. And specifically, I want to talk about Sacred Harp or shape note singing. So, we'll hear this tradition referred to in both ways, both as sacred harp and as shape note singing. And it looks like what you see on the left here. So, take a moment to take a quick look. And you'll notice that this is notation which is similar to, but pretty different from, the notation you're used to reading. It uses a staff, it uses a clef, it uses a time signature, but it also uses these different shaped note heads, as you can see here. The idea was that by notating hymns, you can tell here that this is a hymn in multiple parts, in 3 parts that's written, by using this sort of notation for hymn writing, that more people would be able to read it and more people would be able to participate. More people would be able to read it because of those shaped note heads. I'm going to give you a video about this that gives you an idea of what these note heads mean. But as you can see right here, each of those different note head shapes basically implies a different note of the scale or a different relationship between each of the notes that are going to follow. So the idea is that if you could memorize the shapes of those note heads, you could sight read without needing to be able to read and understand music in the way that you do as a trained musician. The idea is that your family member who has no formal musical training would be able to learn what a round note head meant, what a triangular note head meant, what a square note head meant, and what a diamond note head meant. And then they would be able to pick up this book, the Sacred Harp book, and read out of it. They would be able to participate in the singing of hymns, whether they knew that hymn before or not, and whether they were able to read music or not. So the idea is that by using this notation, we're going to find a sort of democratization, a greater accessibility to communal singing. And this is a tradition that is going to start up in Protestant churches in the US and is going to spread. And in fact, it's still practiced today. You'll still find some churches and some communities that continue to use that original Sacred Harp book and that continue to use this kind of notation. Again, because of how it invites people in, how it makes it much more accessible for people to be able to sing along. So there's a real emphasis on community and emphasis on accessibility here that allows for group amateur music making to happen pretty quickly and pretty easily in a way that is really satisfying for the people there. Because you can imagine if you go to a religious gathering and you want to be a part of it, and you realize that everyone's singing, but you can't read the system in which that music is notated, that could make you feel less a part of the community. So the shape note singing is a real way to break down that barrier and to welcome more people into the practice of this singing. So again, there's a quick video to explain what shape note singing looks like, how it's printed, and how it makes sense. And then I've got another video for you that's going to show some contemporary social singing, some contemporary sacred harp groups. As you watch and listen to this, you're going to notice that the tone color is really different than what you're used to. These people are not trained musicians, and they are not trying to create the same kind of tone that we do when we are trained to sing or when we are trained to use our personal instrument in a particular way. So be ready for that. Some of it might sound a little ugly compared to what you're used to, but again, be thinking of the purpose here. Why these people are singing and why that accessibility matters. And that should give us an idea of why the sacred harp tradition is so important. It also gives us a little bit of insight into American music making at this time. We've talked about almost none up until this point. We've been really Eurocentric. But there are musical traditions that are happening in the US, and this social singing represents one of them. So please take a look at this video as well. But now we have to go back to Europe. And when we do so, we're going to be returning to song, but a different kind of song than we talked about before. So the last time we discussed song, we talked about lieder, or art song, that are typically performed by two parts, voice part and piano part. But part song is going to be exactly what it sounds like. It is going to be a song with multiple vocal parts, typically 2 to 4 vocal parts that could be sung by amateurs. So if we break that down a little bit and think about what that means, we will need something that's not going to be super challenging in range and something that might be a little bit repetitive in form. Something that amateurs are going to like to sing, but that won't be so challenging that it'll push them away from it. So we need something that's going to be welcoming, relatively accessible, a little bit of a challenge, but not so bad that people will get scared off. So that's a bit of a challenge for a composer. You want to be able to create something that's going to be interesting, that's going to serve the text well, that's going to challenge you as a composer in some ways, but you also want to make sure you're meeting what the public wants. So you might think, why would a composer even bother to write these? The answer to that is kind of obvious, and it is money. If we are creating a kind of music that people can perform in their home with their friends, then you have many more potential buyers than if you're writing something for a symphony orchestra. So we find a lot of composers writing many part song and making a fair amount of money off of them too, because they could be used in gatherings such as the one that you see here. We've got friends gathered around a piano, able to sing together, able to be a part of an evening together. And this relates to a lot of romantic ideals and values by hearkening back to the idea of folk expression, to community, and to that linkage between literature and music that has been so important throughout the Romantic. So let's take a quick look at one of those. Number 142 in your anthology comes to us from our old friend Franz Schubert and is titled Die Nacht, which means the night. Schubert is going to write more than 100 of these, which should not be surprising to us given how many songs total he wrote. And what you're going to hear here is in part what we're used to from Schubert's Lieder. We're going to hear a deep connection between music and text, an effort to convey the text through the music. But we're also going to hear some of the challenges that are unique to part songs. So challenges like creating 4 parts that are all relatively interesting. We can't just have one main melody part and everybody else singing boring stuff. And we can't have those parts be too interesting, too challenging. They have to somehow meet in the middle. So, as you listen, please choose one part to follow, either one of the tenors or one of the basses to follow, and think about how challenging it might be. Particularly if you are not a singer. So, all our instrumentalists out there, watch through this and think about if you would be able to perform it with relatively little preparation. And then think about what would be fun to sing about it. There are a lot of moments that are pretty and expressive. We've got some fun dynamic moments. Each part ends up with like an interesting harmonic or rhythmic moment or two. Schubert manages to balance the needs of the text with the needs of his amateur potential performers and to create something that's really fun and that fits the bill for something that you might want to sing with your friends. So go ahead and listen to this one, thinking about how it could be used. And then lastly, we're going to move bigger. We're going to look at the choral society. Choral societies are a thing that are going to become more and more popular during this time period. We're going to find that with this growth of amateur music making with the voice, there's also going to be a growth of more organized amateur music making. And in the late 18th century, so the late 1700s, we're going to find choral societies popping up in different countries. Germany likes choral societies a lot. Britain likes choral societies a lot. And a prime example of this would be the Berlin Singakademie that the Mendelssohns will be involved in. These choral societies would be like a really good community band. The members would pay dues. There would be a conductor, and the group would buy music. That could be commissioning new works, or it could be purchasing already published works. I make a point of this buying music thing because for a larger ensemble, that's going to be more of a money commitment than buying music for your friends to sing around the piano, right? So we've got these groups that are a part of new music. They're going to be performing some of these newly composed works, which is really interesting because we tend to think of professional groups as filling that role. But here we have skilled and knowledgeable amateurs who care enough about what they're doing to put money into it and to practice. So the choral society is a really, really interesting thing here. As you might expect, the members of choral societies are not so much going to be the lower classes. Why? Well, because there are some barriers to entry. You're going to have to pay dues, so you're going to have the money to do that. You're going to have to be able to read music. And you're going to have to be able to rehearse, so you have to have the free time to do that. So because of all those things, we tend to find that these choral societies are upper classes generally, but still amateurs. So still not people who are like making their living doing this. In terms of style, we're going to find some really interesting mixes. There are definite Baroque influences here. We're going to find choral societies singing a lot of oratorios and cantatas. So already you might cast your mind back to the world of your Bachs and your Handels. But they're also living in the early Romantic, and there's no way to ignore what's going on with the Romantic era and Romantic style. So we're going to get a really interesting mix of some of the things we would expect from the Baroque, as well as some of the more expressive things that we would expect from a current Romantic era style. So you might have some fugal stuff. You might have some chorale style writing, but you'll also have some interesting harmonic moments. You'll also have a bigger orchestra, perhaps. They're really, really interesting works that help to highlight what's cool about the choral society. You might ask, why study stuff like this? We've got plenty of professional music makers. Why should we study our amateurs? Well, because that's how the music's being made. We want to know about the musical culture of this era, so we have to know about who's making it, who's listening to it, who cares about it. And that is maybe the most important part of this music history that we do, to be able to understand the use of music whether that's listening use or performance use of music in an era that we're studying. So Mendelssohn's St. Paul is going to be a really good example of this. It is an oratorio, which, as you know, is going to tell us a religious, typically biblical-based story with an orchestra, a chorus, soloists, arias and recitatives, all those things. But it's not going to be staged in the way that we might expect an opera to be staged. So it's a concert work that's going to have a story, going to use some of the building blocks of opera, but it will not be staged. And Mendelssohn's St. Paul is a prime example of that. So he's writing it for about 2 years, from 1834 to 1836, and it will premiere at a Dusseldorf festival with a choral society. So what that means is that there's going to be this focus on singing that, again, will blend those two worlds that we just talked about on the last slide. Some of the Baroque choral writing that we've learned about before with some of the Romantic musical language that we're currently in. So we've got choral societies singing this stuff, which means that, again, skilled amateurs, we have to be aware of that, and that we'll be able to see this sort of blending of traditions. Now, there are a few sections of Mendelssohn's St. Paul that show up in your anthology. They're all under number 143 in your anthology, but I would like for you to focus in specific on the chorus that is presented there. That should be number 15 in your, number 15 within number 143. So as you look at that, you are going to get to see some of the ways that Mendelssohn is writing for orchestra and also writing for chorus. What I would like for you to think about as you listen to number 15 is any similarities to Baroque oratorios that we've already talked about. Cast your mind way back and you will remember some of our Baroque oratorios. I'd also like for you to listen for some of the more contemporary building blocks that Mendelssohn's going to use. What in here sounds kind of romantic? I will give you a hint. We've got a bigger orchestra that is going to use a lot more instruments than you might expect in the Baroque. Lastly, I would again like you to choose one choral line and follow it. So, if you are a singer, choose your voice type. If you're not a singer, or if you are a singer and you're feeling adventurous, choose any of the voices and follow that voice to see what it would be like to sing this. How challenging is it? And that'll give you some insight into these choral societies and what they were able to do. All right, so with that, we will wrap up for today. Again, our focus this time was amateur music making in groups, whether that is in the home through something like that Schubert part song or small group singing, whether that is serving a religious purpose, as we saw with shape note notation and the sacred harp tradition, or whether that is through more public performance that is still amateur, as we see in choral societies and their role in festivals and this Romantic era oratorio tradition. And again, I just want to highlight that we are studying this stuff because this was kind of the real life impact of music during this time period. We focus a whole lot on music making that happens on stage, but as you know from your own lives, there's a lot of music that isn't in formal performance settings. There's a lot of music that fills our worlds in different ways. And if we are going to do a good job as music historians of understanding an era, we got to do a good job of understanding all of that music. So dig into some of this and we'll come back, and next time we will talk about stuff that happens on the stage, but at least we'll do it with more context, thinking about how people are using this music. Thanks, guys.